Look, welcome everyone to this webinar on intersectionality with my colleague, Dr. Colleen Macmillan from CSIRO. We decided to do this webinar on intersectionality just to maybe get people thinking a bit differently about diversity, inclusion and social justice and a few other key concepts that we all come across in our work. But before we do that, I would just like to acknowledge country and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands of which we are all meeting on today, and I'm on Wiradjuri land based in Wagga Wagga, and recognise that connection to land, water and culture, and pay my respects to elders past, present and also those emerging, and also extend that welcome and respect to our Indigenous and First Nations colleagues who are joining us today. So I'm Cate Thomas. I'm from Sturt University. I'm doing a lot of research around intersectionality at the moment. I'm the co-convener for Athena Swan here, convener for Athena Swan here at Sturt, but co-convener for our social equality, inclusion and intersectionality research group as well. I'd like to introduce Colleen Macmillan.
Hello, lovely to be here with you today, Cate, and everyone who's on the call. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that I am presenting from and participating on from today, and that's the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. I would also like to pay my respects to any First Nations people who are on the call today. I'm from CSIRO Agriculture and Food, and I'm the inaugural Inclusion and Diversity Lead there. I also have another hat, which is around cotton biotechnology as a molecular biologist. So doing two very different things which converge, but super excited to be with you today.
Excellent, thank you, Colleen. Look, we will have more of a conversational type approach to this webinar today going forward and look at intersectionality, the why, the who, the how, and look at, you know, how intersectionality can make a bit of a difference, and everyone can have a different viewpoint or a connection to intersectionality or take something away from it, hopefully, from this webinar. Now, what we will do at the end is open up to answers, to questions and answers. So we hopefully will have more of a dialogue at the end. But really encourage you to sort of jot down your questions. You can use the Q&A function if you'd like. So Colleen and I can sort of keep a bit of an eye on some of the questions that are coming through, and maybe that can kick us off with some of the open sort of discussion towards the end. So please don't use the chat function, but use the Q&A. And what we normally do is, if we don't get to everyone's answers at the end, then we will make sure that we try and answer them anyway and circulate that to all the various members who are attending here today. So don't worry if we don't get to you today in terms of answers, we will get you on. So let's actually get into it and let's talk about intersectionality. So what is intersectionality? Well, Intersectionality by Bowleg, and Bowleg, I know this this quote is 2012, but it's really an iconic quote around intersectionality and really frames for me what intersectionality is all about. It's a theoretical framework for understanding how multiple social identities such as race, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status and disability intersect at the micro level of individual experience to reflect interlocking systems of privilege and oppression, such as racism, sexism, heterosexism and classism at the macro social structural level. So that's about taking it from the individual to the societal, the organisation or the policy level, all those structural levels of impact. Now, Kimberly Crenshaw is the founder of the notion of intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw is a woman of colour who is also a lawyer in the US. And what she was finding was that people were segregating people's social identities and really brought around this whole concept of intersectionality. Going to court, it was an issue of being a woman or was it about being a woman and a woman of colour, and how those levels of disadvantage actually aggregate and accumulate and create even further disadvantage or oppression? So the whole concept really came out of Crenshaw's experiences of what she was working with and experiencing herself in the US. And it standed up in terms of this level of activism. And it was really around driving a change about how we thought around social identities and how they impact on each other. Starting as activism, it has moved significantly now into a way to look at how we look at social change more broadly. So from activism, which is still core of it, of the part of the framework of intersectionality, but also how we can make those social changes. Over to you, Colleen.
So this diagram really starts to unpack a little bit more deeply about what intersectionality is and the value it brings to both organisations and to individuals. So right at the centre of that is a diagram that talks about the whole individual. And if you look around where you're sitting right now, if you look at Cate, if you look at me, if you look at the other people participating in this event, and you think about each person, there is so much richness within one person, and the layers of that richness is so powerful. And this is about a positive view of what the intersecting layers might bring and what might mean for the individual at the micro scale, but also at the macro scale. So in the diagram, right in the center, you can see one individual. That individual holds an incredible wealth of diversity of thinking. So that is that ability is that some people have to think in terms of very creative thinking, people who are really good at thinking in terms of risks, people who are really good at thinking about a lot of details all at once, people who are really good at thinking about big picture, people who are really good at scientific thinking, so ordered, rational thinking, people who are very good at left field thinking, all sorts of richness of those neural networks that one person might have in that moment in time. Then there is the diversity of richness of that individual in terms of their knowledge and their skills. So this is acquired, not intrinsic diversity, but acquired diversity. So diversity in terms of academic training, in terms of non-academic training, skills that person might have, that comes through a richness also of the cultures that they've grown up in, the countries they've grown up in, the academic institutions, non-academic institutions they've grown up in. That is acquired. And thirdly, it's that diversity of the networks. So the cross-connectivity of different individuals to their local spheres, to their city spheres, to their state spheres, to their national spheres, to their international spheres. And that is very powerful. So just thinking about the core of the individual and the diversity that one individual holds then brings to light, well, all of that richness is in a context of lots of externalities, and that's where minority status starts to intersect. So it's about where the person has grown up in the cultures they've grown up in, and also the eras that they've grown up in. So if we jump back 200 years ago, how women of colour from a different socioeconomic status has come from will be very different to how we see things now. So intersectionality is complex, but it's also beautifully rich for us as individuals because it's a win-win for everyone. But also if we look at organisations and staff and students and what we have to offer, whether it's the national or global scales, there's a lot of richness to offer too. So that is the core visual description of some of the attributes of what intersectionality is that we're really trying to unpack a little bit today. But there's also some things about why intersectionality is so important. So intersectionality can do a lot of things if we think about it. So it can spark new approaches. So for example, new approaches to problem solving that the standard stereotype majority group may not have come up with in terms of problem solving. It encourages inclusivity, because when we start to think about intersectionality and talk about it and understand its richness, then we start to invite diverse people to the decision-making table, for example, and be curious about what they have to offer. It encourages deepening of our understanding of the human experience and of the worlds that we live in, the natural and artificial worlds we live in. And I like to think of it as a bit of a silver bullet against boredom, because never once, if you're in a space where you're with people who are different to you and you're curious about them, are you bored? Because there's always something new and exciting to learn. And also, it respects and values the unique individual as a whole person. And that is so powerful, because when we give respect to others and value others, they give us respect and value us back. So we've done some research around this. And one of the things that that comes to the fore in the arguments and the findings is that when we're inclusive of diverse humans, there's outcomes for innovation, there's outcomes for impact, and it's good for the people involved as well. So a little bit about the research that we've done is we've published one article in the Challenges journal recently, and we're going to unpack that a little bit more today as we go along. Before we talk a little bit more about the practical aspects of intersectionality at the institutional and organisational levels, I thought we've been talking about the why in conceptual terms, but we can also make it a bit personal. And I'm going to ask Cate Thomas to bare her soul a little bit here and go to you, Cate, and ask you, for you, Cate, what is your personal reason? What's your personal why for why intersectionality and implementation of intersectional frameworks is so important to you in your heart or in your fire in your belly?
Thanks. I knew you were going to ask a curly one straight off. Personally, I think it's really important. Like I come from a social justice viewpoint, but personally myself, who identifies as a woman, who identifies as a person with mobility issues, who identifies himself as same-sex attracted, there are all these different components to me. And I was getting frustrated because either one component or one social identity actually had to stand forward in front of the others, depending on where I was and what work I was working with or who I was working with. And it became really quite concerning for me because it was a point of devaluing, because no one was actually seeing me as the whole and what I could offer as a whole, and segregating the different social identities that different people have is really difficult, and it doesn't bring your true talent to the fore about what you can offer and your capability. And it's not looking at half glass full, is what I often say. So for me personally, it was, I think, well, Kimberly Crenshaw obviously resonated with me and that whole point of activism and trying to make change. But if we can look at how we view diversity and inclusion differently by taking that viewpoint of the whole individual and what brings to the fore, what that individual brings and the talent, then we will have better outcomes for everyone. And it's not about segregating, you know, let's have a policy for this one person or a particular process for another group of individuals. Let's talk about people as a holistic identity and what they can offer. So I hope that answered your question. So it was quite personal for me to see the level of disadvantage that I was experiencing because of various things. I suppose I can ask you the same question back, Colleen. What about you? How about you be your soul?
So yeah, it's I guess it's not fair for me to ask you that question without you asking that question back, and here I am with all these people I don't know, but okay, here we go. So thanks. I've been in the workplace. I've been in the workplace for about 30 years. So I've been working in science organisations. I've been working in academic institutions mostly for those 30 years. And what I've seen makes me very passionate about intersectionality, because I've seen brilliance sparkle in front of me in these institutions. And it's been so evidently sparkling in terms of science ideas and creative thinking and opportunities and problems. But what I've seen is also that brilliance not being seen by other people, by people who are of the majority group. And largely what has concerned me is that that brilliance, when it's, sparkling and not seen, it's often been people who are in the minority, and a very small minority, but it's been women of colour, of different lower socioeconomic status. Sometimes it's also men of lower socioeconomic status, people from different cultures or different language groups that are not having English as their first language, people with different abilities. But when they've compounded in individuals who are putting these brilliant things out there, and this is at all layers, so I'm thinking 3 decades of it, and I've seen it a lot. It just is so, it's such a lost opportunity time and time again for 2 reasons. One, the potential for science to create solutions is gone. And I've seen those brilliant people wither and leave those organisations and just walk out the door with their brilliance of thinking and their skills and their networks. They just go eventually. And to me, that is just such a loss. That isn't just such a loss. And it's silly, because we haven't got time to waste now with brilliance just being hidden under a little bushel or leaving our organisations. We haven't got time for that now. We've got too many problems to solve. So I guess I get a little bit frustrated at that. And I still see it today, like after 30 years, I still see it and I call it out to make sure that we can bring out the brilliance and get on with it. So yeah, that's me bearing my soul a little bit, I guess. But if we go out from the personal why and we look at the institutional how, right? So here we are. So what can we do? We all have reasons why we want to see change around intersectionality. What can institutions do, and how can they do it to embrace the strengths that intersectionality brings and reduce the barriers that exist? One of the things we can think about are the different layers of what we have in our organisations and institutions. So we can think about the how in terms of what leadership can do. We can think about the processes and practices we can change, and we can think about staff and students. Those are the sort of the different scales we can think about in terms of the how, because it is a big piece of work.
Yeah, that's a really good way to actually to frame it out, to picture it, those different layers. So if I pick one, in terms of, let's look at leadership. What are some practical things that leaders could do in terms of intersectionality, like tools, strategies? What could something be that leaders can do?
So look, I think there are some really clear, practical, best practice things that leaders can do. So if there are any leaders on the call here, think about some of these, because these things do work, but also you can take it out to your own institutions and think about how this can be implemented at various scales in terms of leadership layers. For leaders personally, there is a very simple hierarchy of cognition that leaders can employ within themselves, and this is best practice. So this is number one, and this is based on Bloom's hierarchy of cognition. And so you go from harvesting information very broadly, so being curious about getting lots of different information from different sources. So when we look at people who bring lots of diversity, but compounding diversity to the table, if you're a leader, be curious for what that richness of diversity is that you can tap into. Don't always just go to one small cohort that you always go to. Broaden it out to thinking about the multiple layers of diversity that you can reach out to, and be curious for that. But beyond that, actually then comprehend what that diversity is giving you. So this is higher order cognition, right? That's actually taking on board the richness that you've been given, understanding what those people are trying to say and give to you, and then actually then taking it to that top level of higher order cognition, which is then creating something new out of it. So that's Bloom's, and all of us can, as leaders, big L leaders and little L leaders, can employ that in terms of our own leadership. And that is number one, going to take us very far in terms of harvesting and lifting up multiple aspects of diversity in our workplaces. Number two, there are programs that leaders can undertake in terms of inclusive leadership training for themselves and for their leaders, and that is something that multiple institutions have on offer. So that's another very rich thing that people can do.
Wow, that's really good.
Yep. There are other things that leaders can do, but I think without resting too much on leaders, there's also things that academic staff and professional staff can do too. So perhaps you might have some ideas that you'd like to share around that.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I think too, and I'm just looking at some of the questions that are popping up that actually really quite relate to this as well. In terms of professional staff or customer service staff, I know there's one about how to show the strengths of service users, and whether it be professional development or with working with curricula, like in the education sphere. I think it's really clear to actually link, and Jackie, this is going to link your question a bit here too. It's really important to start talking about intersectionality and inclusion. Intersectionality is a lens or a framework that builds an inclusive practice, whether it's inclusive leadership or inclusive practice going forward. And it's about how we conceptualize and engage with everyone. It's really about how we engage and seeing all the components of everyone and all the different social identities. This is what intersectionality is about. So it's a completely different thought pattern to the traditional ways of looking at inclusion, diversity, and saying, okay, people with disabilities are over here and LGBTIQ, you're over here, rather than bringing everyone together. And as Colleen was sort of alluding to, putting everyone around the table and trying to co-create a response to a particular issue, which will benefit everyone who is actually there in that particular organisation. And that is that strengths-based approach as well to it. But in terms of that professional development or that educational side, I think it's really important that we actually start incorporating information and different ways to embed intersectionality into curricula, because we are actually growing the next cohort of professionals and practitioners as we go forward. And if we're going to make a real serious change here about how we engage and improve our society, particularly around trying to minimise disadvantage and you know, decrease vulnerabilities, and really, as you were saying earlier, bring to the fore that capability and talent that everyone has and harnessing it, it has to start in education. So I would really challenge people that if you could, to start thinking about how do you weave in intersectionality, either as a professional development tool or as part of your curricula. And we are working on that a little bit at the moment. Our collaboration that we're working on, and our collaboration is with ANU, UC, SAGE, CSIRO and Charles Sturt. And we are looking at all those different ways to actually start incorporating it. But in terms of that intersectionality, you can't separate it from inclusion, because ultimately that's what it's about. And when I talk about inclusive leadership, or thought leadership, or thoughtful, mindful leadership even, it's seriously coming down to how we engage, how we look beyond, as Erica also indicated earlier, how we look beyond a particular function to actually seeing people and the resources that they bring and the value that they bring to the organisations. In terms of professional, just to go on a little bit further, and how we identify our service users, well, again, that's about developing our customer service staff, who are our frontline people, to actually look at how they view our customers and how they are individuals with talent, capability and value as well, rather than just people who are coming to access a particular service. So again, it's about how we engage and value and see who our customer service recipients are differently, and it may evoke a response to how then we deliver our particular service to those customers as well. So again, engaging with them, co-creating, understanding what their issues are, whether it be, you know, a student, an academic, a professional person out in you know, non-government or government. It's all about engagement. So maybe that's just a few ideas, but really it's a bit of a challenge I put out to people, and I suppose over time we'll be happy to assist you to look at how we could embed some educational components. But if we're going to make a change, we have to start, and we can do that by implementing an intersectionality framework. Did that answer your question, Colleen?
Yes. I think processes make a difference. Leadership makes a difference, and I think your call for us all to respond to that call and act rather than only think, now that we know what it is pretty powerful. Yeah. I'm seeing some very interesting questions come through here. So I'm also trying to juggle answering questions, but let's see how we go. Because there's a lot of really interesting, amazing dialogue here. Yeah. Okay, so one of the things we can look at is also some practical processes that people can implement. And Cate, you talked about co-creation. I think of one example that was co-created that was a win-win for many people. It's a very small process change, but it starts to just normalize as business as usual, having a place and a space and practice that is inclusive of very diverse people. So here's just a very small example that was co-created, and it's called full-time equivalent year. It's just a pro rata measure of time rather than calendar years. And it was co-created with a lot of scientists at CSIRO, because when you go for promotions or when you apply for grants, quite often your output is measured in quantitative terms. And so for those people who have been out of that particular role, outside of full-time role, or have had career breaks, or breaks in terms of secondments, or breaks in terms of health or disability, having just looking at people's outputs and measuring outputs over standard calendar years was actually disadvantaging a lot of different types of people in the science sphere. So there was a little solution created called full-time equivalent year. Literally, it's a box on a form. So on CSIRO's promotions forms now, there's a box and you say, these are how many calendar years I've been in the role, but also these are the number of full-time equivalent years I've been in the role. So that people can look at your papers and your research dollars and your impacts, whatever they are, and then go, okay, we can normalize it to that number. And in terms of it being a win-win for people from different intersecting diversity characteristics, that makes a big difference for anyone, and no one's losing from that. And that's the beauty of co-creating solutions, by listening to lots of different voices, not just one cohort. By building in practical processes like that, that is embracing of multiple layers of diversity, we get a shift then in the cultural mindsets as well, like, oh, these are also valid human beings, and starting to see the whole human being rather than, oh, those are all this one group who are always complaining, they're not important. So by changing process, we also then change the cultural mindset of respecting and valuing, which is quite nice. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's sorry, keep going.
Yeah, no, that's all I wanted to say around the concept of processes then changing culture.
Oh, that's great. And it sort of runs into our anonymous attendee, who has put a really great point forward there around those with maybe more different social identities that are being impacted at times are the more vulnerable and less able to speak, or are more vulnerable and are not listened to, which is a really important point. And I think that's sort of going back to both what Colleen has just mentioned about co-creation, but also about how we, as potential, recipients of services, or those who are actually providing the service, if they are more mindful of that level of vulnerability and the social identities going forward, and engaging differently to actually be strengths-based in that approach, hopefully it will recognise change. But it also goes to a point, and this is probably a really big point of mine when it comes to intersectionality, is around lots of time people don't actually understand these different identities that individuals may encompass as the whole. And that's really hard when it comes to that professional development point, or that engagement point, and trying to get that change of mindset. So it's around what I call expanding the comfort zone. Like the old saying is, people only know what they know, or what they want to know, is really true in some respects, because if people haven't been able to experience a level of vulnerability or a disadvantage or a social identity, which is also transient, so it could be contextualized to that particular point in time. It is dynamic. It doesn't always need to remain stagnant. But we need to actually expand people's understanding of social identities and vulnerabilities, and taking that forward. And there's a key way to do that we have actually done a bit of research on, and it's also in our paper that we'll make available to everyone that have attended today. But it's about empathy. And this is the whole point about engaging. It's really about empathy and being able to understand how social identities actually accumulate, congregate, impact, and and become a cumulative disadvantage for individuals, those vulnerabilities. It's really hard if, say, you're a white middle-aged man who may have a level of privilege that may have never been exposed to a single mother who is a woman of colour who has children with disability. They may not understand each other's worlds, and that's a real thing. So for us to actually create a level of change is about creating that level of empathy, to be open, to engage, and that's also a tool that we can use. Colleen, I'm going to ask you a question now before we sort of go back to these other broader questions that are there. Do you want to tell the participants on our webinar today just a little bit about the intersectionality walk that we offer and that we do, and how it could be used as a tool in organising?
Sure, happy to. So the intersectionality walk is an educational tool for really lived experience for an hour. It was created through the SAGE ACT Regional Network, and it was first delivered in 2020 in February in person at a national conference in Adelaide. And the experience has now shifted where you can do an intersectionality walk virtually, not just in person. And this is what happens. You go into a space for about an hour and a half, and you get to walk in someone else's shoes for that time. You're given a persona, and that persona may or may not have multiple intersecting diversity characteristics. There's a whole mix of different types of personas. You get to be one person and step in their shoes. You then go into a virtual workplace and you experience the workplace through that in that persona's shoes. And you experience workplace scenarios, and every time there's a negative impact on your persona, you take a step back from the center core starting point. What happens is you start to see how very simple workplace scenarios can impact on that persona, and that gives you a sense of walking in someone else's experience. It's very safe, but you get to start to feel that empathy and see what happens when different personas step back through the compounding impacts in the workplace. But it's not about doom and gloom and all the awful things that can happen. It then also builds in an opportunity to say, well, I'm living in this persona for this hour and a half. Here are the practical things that I think in this persona we could do to create a positive change. So it's co-creating in the moment. And then we walk again with changed scenarios still within that workplace. And we see how building in co-created change by listening and learning and adapting then changes how people experience that workplace through solutions that are win-win for everybody. So we've delivered it quite a few times now. I think we've now touched 39 higher education and research institutions, both nationally and internationally, over the last 16 months since we first started delivering these intersectionality walks. We've learned from the experiences too, so we've changed and we've created new scenarios and new virtual workplaces, and there's even a virtual tracking tool now with COVID that then really reaches out to multiple layers. Recently I ran one intersectionality walk with some leaders within CSIRO, middle management leaders and senior management leaders, and immersed them in different personas, and that was just such a rich experience for them to walk in very diverse shoes. So that's an overview of where it's come from and how it's tracking and what it involves. And there's also facilitator training. So if people want to become an intersectionality walk facilitator, there's also options around that as well.
And just to go on for that, and one of the questions was about, you know, do we use sort of real life experiences? We build our personas on people's real life experiences and particular intersections as well. And the scenarios are actually built and tailored to the particular organisation that we're actually rolling the walk out to. But what I want to say is we actually use personas. This is not a privilege walk, and it's really quite different to a privilege walk. Personas is actually creating a safe environment for individuals to actually participate in learning about intersectionality, because it's not about what I call and have named as identity threat. Because you don't have to expose yourself in that walk situation, but you get to literally live in the shoes of someone else. And it's about expanding your understanding of intersectionality and how those things can impact. I think one of the key things about doing exercises like that is when we stop and reflect on how different scenarios impact on individuals, then going through and engaging the participants to talk about, well, what is it? What are the structural things and barriers that need to be removed? What is it? What are the strategies that can be put into place for each of these organisations to make a change? And some of them are really simple things to, you know, it could be, you know, not going to the pub to do welcome drinks because, you know, we might have a whole range of different diverse individuals, and some may not drink or maybe against religion to drink. And so maybe holding every welcome event at a you know, a nice courtyard area in the work premises or something like that. So it's about getting everyone to actually start building and thinking about how they can do things differently. So everyone can participate, be included, and recognising the diversity of everyone. There's also a lot of questions that have come up that I think we might move into, because we've only got about 15 minutes left, and I really want to go through some of these questions that have been put forward. Gemma, thank you very much for this question. This is, what is the future in intersectionality research and development? Do you think it will be better understood by institutions and the general public? Yes, I absolutely think so. So every time we run our walk, our intersectionality walk, we actually gain a lot of research data from it. There's three lots of surveys that we do, a pre, a post the walk, and then one several months later to look at what has actually changed in the organisation, in the institution. Has there been organisational, behavioural and cultural change in terms of diversity and inclusion based on what was done within the intersectionality walk? Intersectionality is a really big thing at the moment. Everyone is, there's a lot of people beginning to get into intersectionality and really take on the point that this is the next stage of evolving diversity and inclusion. So there is a lot of work and a lot of research that is actually happening in this space. What I think is actually happening is the research that is done, if it's evidence-based research, and then it is transformational and it's being translated back into practice, which is what we're trying to achieve, Colleen and I, and our collaboration trying to achieve, is really have that transformational level of research. Then yes, there will be changes in institution and the general public. But I think it's one strategy. The other strategy, as I said earlier, is about education and how we go out and we educate about intersectionality, but it's also about calling out as well. If we see things, it's about calling out that, you know, it's not okay and doing things like that. So let's see what else. Does the IW scenario include the participant reflecting on how they can make changes? Yes, absolutely. That was very much the key thing there. Yes, Sally, this would be impactful and empowering for Aboriginal women's wellbeing. Absolutely. Absolutely. And one of our personas that we actually use is an Indigenous woman. Purely based on that comment is identical to why we have included that particular scenario. So we've tried to include a whole range of really diverse personas and scenarios to really bring to light. And one of our key, I suppose, emphasis in building this research and building this educational tool was to make sure that First Nation voices are actually heard and building and trying to make a change. Yeah. Colleen, is there some questions that you would like to answer?
You've answered the key ones that I've seen so far. I mean, there's just so many great comments and points here. Incredible. Not at the moment, but I'm still reading.
So, well, maybe we'll throw a question to the participants from today, and I know there will be a poll that Claire Ellis will put up in a little while at the end of this particular webinar around, you know, learning and understanding. But what are some of the challenges that you as participants that are on the line today are facing in terms of intersectionality? And is there a strategy that you would like to take forward to try and evoke some change? And while you're doing that, Hannah, the Intersectionality Walk, we'll put up an email link very shortly. So gender equity at csu.edu.au. We're really happy for people to send inquiries there, and we will get some information to you and let you know. Lou from Brisbane has raised your hand. I don't know if we can hear from you, Lou from Brisbane. But if you're suggesting if we can do it all over, yes, we can. There we go, Lou from Brisbane. Hello, Lou. Lou, would you like to unmute? And no, not happening. Yes, age and challenging ageism, particularly denoting generations, very important. Very, very important. And that's another one of those isms that can be included under the Bowleg definition of intersectionality. And I think there's a lot of different isms. And I think too, don't forget that, you know, intersectionality, what we're doing today is trying to provide a bit of a framework, a lens to have more of an understanding around intersectionality and looking at those issues of co-creation and bringing people to the table and engagement. But intersectionality does mean different things to different people. And we've got to understand that as well and take that on board. And as I was indicating before, it can be quite contextual. So, you know, sometimes something could be a privilege to one person, but could be a disadvantage to that same person, depending on the context that they're actually in. So it is dynamic in that sense, and very important to be aware of that. So it's 10:02. There's still more things coming through, but Colleen, have you got? Oh, there's a lot that's just coming in. What's the biggest challenge you have come across with getting people to think with an intersectional lens? Is the lack of common lived experience. Cliff, yes, I think that is pretty much so. If I can be really bold and say people live in their own world and sometimes don't want to expand their lived view, and that is one of the hardest things, and that's one of the challenging things. Both Colleen and I have had questions before around, well, what's an intersectionality walk? Why don't we talk about privilege? But we don't want to actually talk about privilege. And do a privilege walk. We want to look at how people can onboard an understanding a framework around intersectionality instead, and looking at what we can do to harness talent and capability. Does it have a trauma-informed approach? Yes, absolutely. I struggle a bit in terms of being a young female trying to establish myself, someone who is knowledgeable in the field due to my age and gender. Absolutely. That's a really big issue, particularly for women in the higher education and the research area or in research institutes. And lots of policies are beginning to emerge around, relative to opportunity, part-time work, as Colleen was indicating before, a whole range of things, but we've still got a long way to go. But we're getting there. We're beginning to chip away at those things, and that's the benefit of it. We're beginning to chip away, but we've still got work that we can do about changing behavioural and cultural thinking within organisations.
And to build on what you've just said, Cate, in response to that very important point, that's why talking about the how for leaders, so leaders in the spheres that the questioner is working in and studying in, no, you're working in that space. Your leaders at multiple levels, middle management and senior management, having them understand intersectionality and the value that it brings, and knowing how, as leaders, how to approach the enormity of diversity and inclusion through intersectionality. That is so critical, because so that's one aspect of the how, but for you in particular, there's nothing that you yourself can do. So I want to give you a direct piece of advice. You don't need to fix yourself. You're not in deficit model. You are not in deficit. You've got a wealth of richness that you can bring out, and you know that, and the world is going to try and tell you that maybe you are in deficit model, but please don't try and fix yourself. Shine with what you've got. And so keep that in your back pocket always, and go to the places that are positive and that can see whatever great things you have to offer the universe. But please don't try and get get the senior leaders to change, because that's the work of people in power.
Well said, Colleen. Well done. Joyce and John, yes, absolutely. Breaking down stigmas and stereotypes is absolutely a big challenge. And I think that's the beauty of intersectionality, because it gets to start thinking about how to differently conceptualise us as humans, as individuals who can contribute and participate in organisations and in society more broadly. And just to respond to Lou, yeah, absolutely. The cultural context is really big in our intersectionality walk as well, and we really target people from different cultures, and looking at how different things actually impact as well going through. Mary, really good question here. As an Aboriginal worker in education, I'm the only identified person in the office, and I'm so tired of always needing to explain our ways. How can I help use this resource to help me? I think this is a perfect resource for you doing the intersectionality walk. And maybe, Mary, we can have a bit of a chat offline. Really happy to do that, and look at maybe having a bit of a discussion about some opportunities that are there that we can, yeah, just see and have a bit of a chat. We've only got a couple of minutes to go, so I just thought, look, I'll just put up that gender equity at charlessturt.edu.au email there. So if there are people who are interested in doing the intersectionality walk, or who are interested in joining our new social equality, intersectionality and inclusion research group, please feel free to drop me a line and Colleen a line at that email, and we will definitely get back to you. The other thing we will do is try and respond to all the questions. I know we've missed some of them. We didn't get to all of them, but it's been absolutely lovely to have you all here today, to have such a conversation. We really planned for it to be a conversation, and to get you involved in this webinar. And it's been really great to see your comments and your views, and taking on board some of the different things that you might use, Catherine, you know, in terms of your speech path, things like that. That's really, really fantastic. So thank you very much for being a part of this webinar. And Colleen, would you like to make some final remarks?
It was great to have this conversation with you, Cate. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you to everyone online. The richness of your input today, Gemma and Jackie as well, in terms of women's leadership development. There's so much that we can share and learn and progress this. And I guess for me, going out of this webinar today, two things I will take with me. One is your challenge to me, Cate, and to us, Cate, to act, not to sit still, but to act and keep this moving. And to the action that those at the decision-making table, people in power, where I can influence, I think that's the key piece that I want to take with, because I can see all this amazing engagement and comments here, and so it's a bit more energy to keep the dial moving. So thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, my pleasure having you, and thank you for accepting the opportunity and offer to come and have a chat with me today. So what I might do now is actually stop sharing my screen. We'll just stay on, because I know Claire would like to put up a poll for everyone to do. But as I said, look, if anyone's got any ideas or questions, or are interested in the research that we're doing, or interested in the intersectionality walk and what we've found thus far, please drop us a line at the genderequity@csu.edu.au, and we can go from there. We'll just wait for Claire to put up the poll. If you can sort of hang around to do the poll, that'd be great.
The poll's already up and people are already completing it.
Excellent.
So I think we've got, what have we got so far? We've got 46% of people have participated so far. So if you haven't, please give us some feedback, because it gives us a bit of an idea, indication of future webinars and things that people might need to like to hear from in the future. So, and thank you everybody for coming. I'll leave the poll open until the very end of the webinar, so you've got time to sort of fill it in. It's only brief, but thanks very much for filling it in if you do. Oh, we've got 95%, 100% participation. Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I'll end the poll.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Enjoy, stay safe, be careful, and look after your own well-being. And don't forget about intersectionality. It's the way forward. Okay, thank you, everyone.